Hello everyone, welcome back to Altengrad City in City Skylines. This episode will be slightly different because it is high time I talked about some more specific plans for the future of Altengrad and overall introduce the next decade and the next half of the century that we just entered. In the background you will see some memorials being built, which kind of felt fitting for this introduction. So far in the series, we mostly focused on the 20s and 30s to build the city and prepare it for the new development. That was the plan all along. A major milestone was the advance into the 40s, which was of course focused on the Second World War and what happened in the city. Then we did some repairs and continued a few pre-war projects in the last two episodes. The city didn't suffer the same fate as many Central European cities. It was not almost entirely flattened, which I also explained in those previous parts. Now we advance into the 50s. We didn't really stay long in the 40s, mostly because this series is aimed at building or changing the city, and in that decade simply not much was built for obvious reasons. But that completely changes in the 50s, and I have many different projects planned. The city ended up in the so-called Eastern Bloc. This means that in real life, this inspiration is now going to be taken mostly from Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Hungary. The real-life political development in those countries was somewhat different at first, but ultimately the same, as the local communist parties gained total power with close ties to Moscow, of course. The series doesn't have a motivation to explain history in detail. If you are interested in that, then there is plenty of reading available on the internet, many YouTube videos as well. So I would just be repeating that and steer the direction of the series in a completely different way. And also, Altengrad is in a fictional country, taking inspiration from multiple places in Central Europe, so we would need to spend hours taking a look at all those countries or creating some kind of a mix between them, and I really don't want to do that. But clearly, the various building projects and city changes are going to be influenced by politics, economy, and related ideas, policies, societal changes, and so on. So we must touch those subjects sometimes. Now, the reason for me to pick the Eastern Bloc for Altengrad is simple. I am from the Czech Republic, former Eastern Bloc country. I know its history, how it worked here, and how it looks today. So I want to explore something similar in Altengrad, although taking inspiration from all those countries that I mentioned, because, again, the city is supposed to be in a fictional country. I have seen many comments saying that the city should be this or that, but this is simply how I want to do it. I suppose a disclaimer is needed at this point. I clearly do not sympathize with the past regimes, and I am 100% glad that they are gone. The fact that I will be showing some symbols or talking about the past or even mentioning some good things from the past does not mean that I'm wishing for the good old times to return or anything like that, right? It's just history. I like studying history. We can't change history, and history wasn't completely pink and bright or totally evil and dark. It was, and it still is, complicated, so hopefully you guys can see that. So with that out of the way, let's focus on Altengrad itself. The projects that I have in mind for this decade will focus on all kinds of areas: infrastructure, industry, various buildings, and so on. They are not going to be built in any particular order. We are just generally in the 50s, early, late, doesn't really matter. In the beginning, and also in the previous episode, you could have seen some new vehicles that we will now see on the streets and on the rails, including new trams, so that's gonna be a huge change. And by the way, I'm definitely planning at least one more tram ride, probably once we finish some projects I have in mind for the city center. Anyway, let's focus more on the memorials that I'm building here. Right after the war, all kinds of statues and monuments were popping up all over the place. In general, these kinds of objects are built to reinforce or remind the people of certain ideals or identities, either by showing some individuals, events, or groups of people. That on its own is kind of neutral, but it can be of course misused by the current regimes to push their agenda or remind the people who's in charge who they should thank for their new freedom, security, prosperity, and so on, in quotation marks of course. But it's very important to say that not every single memorial built throughout the second half of the 20th century was a communist propaganda tool. And it's also important to mention that a lot of memorials were actually really high quality from the artistic or technical point of view, as they were ordered to be made by already established artists, especially right after the war. The quality started to decline in later decades, though, as certain artists were either banned or just didn't want to comply, especially when ordered to do some highly political stuff, and the new artists, slightly less competent yet more politically inclined, started to take their place. Now, what kind of memorials were being built? Especially after the war, lots of statues of Soviet or local leaders. This ended somewhat after the initial Stalinist period in the mid-50s, when some statues were even removed, but statues or bustes of certain accepted leaders were still being built, all the time in the later decades as well. A larger group were memorials remembering the achievements and losses of the militaries, mostly the Red Army and sometimes the local servicemen and women if they were deemed politically acceptable. So no or very few memorials to the soldiers fighting in the ranks of the British forces, for example. Next, there were memorials to the civilians lost during the war and memorials of just general events or ideals like peace, freedom, or communism, of course. Now, there's the question still being asked today, which of these are fine by today's point of view and which of these are just unacceptable propaganda of the time that might even serve to rekindle the bad ideas from the past? That's a hard question. Of course, with some statues it's easier than with others, like statues of Stalin are a no-brainer, but memorials to fallen soldiers, for example? Certain countries or regions treat it differently. There is the Memento Park in Budapest, which simply collected the removed statues into one place, into some sort of a dictatorship museum. In a lot of other places, the statues were simply removed, archived, or reworked to, for example, provide some text freely saying what the statues represent or what the individuals did in their lifetimes, so people have the full picture. And then you have, for example, the very famous Lenin statue in Odessa turned into Darth Vader. In Altengrad, I eventually decided, I suppose just like with the war damage, to go easy with the memorials, because realistically there should have been a lot more. And I'm especially not doing those kinds of like personal statues to certain leaders or individuals, because not only they are not in the workshop, because I suppose no one really wants to make those, right? And I just kind of don't want to put Altengrad on the map. I said that, it's supposed to be like a fictional country, so it wouldn't really make that much sense. Even though it is a fictional country, it is still like controlled by the Soviet Union at this point, and, that had realistic leaders. So I'm kind of thinking of Altengrad as being set in the actual historical settings, but not really geographically, right? I'm not really sure if that makes sense or not, but hopefully it does. Anyway, the kind of statues that we are doing in here, I'm not really saying that that's all of the statues that are going to be present in the city even in the later decades. Obviously not even in real life every single statue was built in the 50s. Like, for example, this one that I'm doing right here is based on the Slavin Memorial in Bratislava, and it wasn't built in 50s. It was built in the 60s, I believe in the 1960s exactly, even though I might be wrong about that. It doesn't really matter, but the basic idea is the same. It's supposed to be just some kind of a war casualty memorial, remembering the fallen soldiers of the Red Army that participated in liberating the overall area, not just the city as a whole. Now, I chose this place in particular because there used to be that battle in that war episode, if you remember, and I was also kind of planning to have this place renovated. So just like I explained in the previous episode, I'm kind of doing certain things in the past to justify the future changes, right? So I already kind of knew that I want to have this memorial in this area, which was the reason to do that battle in this particular place, right? Right at the start of this build, you could have seen me just remove those like dirt marks that were present in this area as a remnant of that battle in here. So, like I said, this particular area is heavily inspired by the Slavin Memorial, and I also, replicated some elements in here. Now, the real-life memorial is much more symmetrical than this one, even though it's not super symmetrical, which kind of, gave me the idea to go even crazier with the asymmetry in this place, because the island is also not symmetrical. The place reserved for this memorial is not exactly all that even. So, it kind of made sense. I just wanted to do something slightly more interesting, right? So that's why I decided on this shape, and the number of graves, for example, isn't the same on both sides in here, and also the memorial itself is not copying the geometry of well, it kind of copies the geometry of the island, I suppose, but not the street that is running, or the main avenue that is running across the island. Even though I tried to position the memorial so that it's aligned, so that it's it's one of its edges is parallel to just the rest of the city, right? Because if you are standing at the memorial, as you can see, it's elevated. You are just looking directly at the castle, for example, or the city center, all the rest of the city as a whole, right? So it's not exactly representing or respecting the layout of the island, but it's kind of respecting, the layout of the city, if that makes sense. I'm not really sure. But again, I just did this to make it slightly more interesting. Now, also, I needed to somehow detail the place, but I needed to keep in mind that this is a new structure. So I only used some kind of low trees. I tried keeping some of the old trees in the area, even though there is a bit of a problem, because I'm, of course, using the random tree rotation. Well, not really that, but, different kinds of modern mods. I don't remember their names. And if I'm going to do any kind of terrain change, then the trees are going to rotate. And if you're going to turn that off, then they are going to rotate again. So it's like a lose-lose situation. The trees are always going to be rotated, so they are not going to stay the same as they were. So, I talked about this in the previous episode, where I said that I need to not touch the trees that are already existing, standing in place, but that's just not possible, right? If I'm going to do any kind of terrain changes, or just, inevitably going to do some tiny adjustments. But I'm definitely trying to at least keep the trees at their same places. And the new trees that I'm placing in here, I'm making sure that they are short, because obviously they are new, they need to have some time to grow. So this is the finished memorial. I really like it in here. And also what I really wanted to do here is to illustrate, I'm not really sure if it's a good idea or not, but to kind of illustrate the contrast, because obviously on one side of the island you have the monastery, and then on the other side of the island you suddenly have like a military statue, basically, right? Commemorating the achievements and losses of the Red Army in the Second World War. So there's like a huge contrast between those places, which might indicate that, communists didn't exactly care about these kinds of things. Now we move into a new location, and here I'm going to do a slightly smaller statue, which is actually something commonly found in all kinds of places of the former Eastern Bloc, and that's basically some kind of a memorial representing some kind of a military hardware, right? It's also usually like a memorial that commemorates or remembers the casualties of the war of those particular armies, or maybe it just represents, some kind of general idea. Doesn't really matter. You can also see these statues still standing today. Obviously, these are the ones that don't really have that much artistic value, because it's literally just a functioning tank put on some kind of a stone, block. It's not modeled from stone or anything. It's actually a steel functioning tank. I believe that there was like a case in Hungary a couple of years ago where they restarted one of these tanks and actually just drove it down the streets. And there are many, many, many like these all around the former Eastern Bloc. I believe in Ukraine they also had a couple of these statues, and they managed to restart some of this hardware as well. So, that only goes to show how these statues were just not exactly all that difficult to make, because it's literally just the vehicle that's already been existing in this area, right? Well, not in this area, but, brought to this place, but just lifted on the block, and that's it, right? And just add some kind of a, plaque with the text at the stone saying whatever you want them to say. But definitely a very small scale project to do, just like in Altengrad that I'm doing right here, even though I'm trying to detail it and make it nice looking with some kind of details around it, some kind of symbols and stuff like that. Now, also, I should mention that it wasn't really uncommon in these kinds of projects to actually have the statue as the minor part of the entire, the entire project. So, for example, especially the bigger monuments, they also included some kind of a plaza or like a big open space, like a huge renovation of some kind of open area. And these days, you have, for example, the statue removed, but the open space is still present with some kind of like grand looking stairs or some kind of stone blocks that don't really have those statues anymore, but they kind of tell you that there used to be something there. Or maybe they don't, maybe people just don't even remember or don't even know that the statues were there, and today is just part of the public space, right? So that's also something kind of interesting. I've recently watched a documentary that actually mentioned that a lot of these big monument areas were super expensive, but the actual price of the statue of like Stalin or whatever were actually kind of minimal compared to the overall budget of the project. So, that's kind of interesting that it's not just about the statues, but it's also just about recovering, well, not recovering, but refurbishing some open areas, right? So that's, kind of interesting, and that's obviously something that I suppose goes beyond the politics, right? Yeah, having nice open areas is like nice thing to have. And even some places, this was actually done intentionally so that people would not exactly, let's say, rebel against the idea of some kind of a statue, because these kinds of statues are obviously representing the regime change sometimes, some of them, and some people didn't like that. But if it was connected to some kind of a renovation, yeah, that's the word that I looked for earlier, renovation. If you also renovated the open area, put some kind of benches or new pavement, planted lots of new nice flowers, then, it started to look like a very nice place. And yeah, whatever, there's like a statue in the middle of it, so, who cares, right? Now, we are in the third place, the last place, where I would like to put a new statue. This one is going to be super small. It's just going to be a statue of a soldier. No one in particular, because these kinds of statues are usually represented either the Red Army as a whole, or the liberation, for example, or maybe some kind of like friendship between the Red Army or the Soviet Union and the new country that Altengrad is in, right? So yeah, nothing all that crazy, even though now that I think of it, this is right next to the government buildings, so maybe I should have constructed something a bit more monumental in that area, or at least decorated it some more, but we can always do that later, Now, not only were new statues built, but they were also removed. Some old statues were also removed because maybe they represented certain ideals or certain individuals who were not exactly sitting well with the new regime. So those might be some leaders of the countries pre-war, or, certain symbols of like a rebellious past of the countries or something like that. And obviously the new regimes didn't want to have those right next to the new symbolism, right? Even though there were instances of these kinds of statues still remaining, because the regime just didn't really want to risk some kind of larger unrest that would probably follow the removal of such statues, which was kind of common. Well, not really common, but sometimes happened in like smaller towns, smaller villages, or something like that. Anyway, this is the finished thing. These are the finished cinematics, and this particular memorial, I really like it. It really fits the island. We finally filled the island with something more than just trees, even though that park there was obviously looking fine. But now we have something, more interesting in here, I suppose. And this is probably the first time where we are going to change something, like drastically change some kind of area in Altengrad into something completely new. So this is probably going to give you the idea how the rest of the series is going to continue, especially in these kinds of, decades that are the 50s, 60s that are going to follow, because there are going to be big changes to the rest of the city. Not just expansion, but also changes in the center. This one in particular, this statue in here didn't really change much. It was already open area, but we did a couple of things here and there, and obviously those kinds of statues, all of those are subject to change in the future. Who knows? Maybe they are not going to stay exactly like that. Maybe they are going to be replaced by something, or different kinds of things. I definitely took inspiration from real life for that particular tank statue, and many different options where we can go with that in the modern times. Anyway, that is going to be all for today's episode. Stay tuned for the new projects that are going to follow, that are going to change the city even more. And hopefully you're going to like it. If you like this one, then you can do the usual. Put thumbs up below the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new here, leave a comment. And if you really liked it, you can become a channel member if you want to support the content directly, support what I do here. Big thanks to all the channel members that we currently have. I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you for your support. That is going to be all. Thank you for watching. Take care and goodbye.